They say every family has secrets. But some families carry a curse so dark, so devastating, that it echoes through generations like a wound that refuses to heal. The Kennedy family is not just any family. They are American royalty, a dynasty built on ambition, power, and an almost supernatural drive to achieve greatness. Yet beneath the polished exterior of their mansions, their political offices, and their carefully curated public image lies a trail of death and destruction so profound that historians and psychologists have spent decades trying to understand it. For generations. 5 tragic deaths. And a mystery that still haunts America. This is the story of the Kennedy curse, a saga of triumph and tragedy, of lives cut short by fate, accident, and circumstances so improbable that many have questioned whether there is something darker at work. Whether divine punishment, cosmic bad luck, or simply the collision of power, privilege, and human fragility, the Kennedy family has paid a price unlike any other American dynasty. Let's begin where all great tragedies begin, at the top with the man who started it all. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. was not born into wealth, but he was born into hunger. The son of an Irish immigrant and a banker's daughter, Joe Kennedy possessed an almost ruthless determination to climb higher than anyone around him. He was a self-made millionaire by his early 20s, a financial wizard who understood the markets the way philosophers understand the human soul. But ambition is never satisfied. Joe Kennedy wanted more than money. He wanted power. He wanted legacy. He wanted his name to matter in a way that echoed through history. In 1914 he married Rose Fitzgerald, the daughter of Boston's powerful mayor. The union was not just romantic, it was strategic. Together they would build an empire. Together they would have 9 children. And together, they would set in motion a series of events that would define not just their own lives, but the entire trajectory of American history. But empire, as we all know, comes with a price. Joseph Jr. was the golden child, the firstborn son whom Joe Sr. had groomed from birth to carry the family's political aspirations into the future. Handsome, charming, intelligent, Joe Jr. was everything his father dreamed of. He was Harvard-educated, charismatic, and possessed of that particular Kennedy magnetism that seemed to attract power and attention like moths to flame. As World War II erupted across Europe, Joe Jr. felt the call to serve. He became a naval aviator, a pilot in the United States Navy, determined to prove himself not just as a Kennedy, but as an American hero. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. was on a dangerous bombing mission over the English Channel. His plane, a B-24 Liberator packed with explosives meant to be remotely detonated over a Nazi target, suddenly exploded in midair. The explosion was so violent, so sudden, that no one could understand what had happened. Theories emerged: mechanical failure, enemy fire, a detonation trigger that malfunctioned. But the truth was lost in the wreckage, lost in the chaos of war. Joe Kennedy Jr. was dead at 29 years old. The golden child, the heir apparent, the future president that Joe Sr. had envisioned, was gone. The impact on the family was seismic. Rose Kennedy, a devout Catholic woman of remarkable composure, mourned privately. Joe Sr., a man of immense pride, carried the wound silently. But something had shifted in the fabric of their family. A shadow had been cast. And it would only grow darker as the years passed. Young John Fitzgerald Kennedy was never supposed to be president. That had been Joe Jr.'s destiny. John, JFK as history would come to know him, was the second son, the backup plan, the young man with charm and intelligence but without the crushing ambition that defined his older brother. After Joe Jr.'s death, however, everything changed. The mantle fell to John. The weight of the family's ambitions, the responsibility to prove that the Kennedy name meant something, that their sacrifices had not been in vain, it all fell upon his shoulders. John Kennedy became a war hero himself, commanding a PT-109 patrol torpedo boat in the Pacific. When a Japanese destroyer rammed his vessel in the darkness, Kennedy found himself in the water, clinging to floating debris, using what remained of his strength to keep his crew alive. He was rescued, but the experience had marked him. War had made him harder, wiser, and more aware of his own mortality. Years later, Kennedy would use his war record and his family's wealth to launch a political career. By 1960, at just 43 years old, he was elected President of the United States. He was handsome, articulate, and represented a new generation of American leadership. He and his wife, Jacqueline Lee Bouvier, a woman of extraordinary grace and intelligence, seemed to embody a new American dream. They had 2 beautiful children, Caroline and John Jr. The future, it seemed, belonged to them. But fate had other plans. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was riding in an open-top limousine through the streets of Dallas, Texas. It was a sunny day. There was a sense of optimism in the air. Kennedy had survived his first term as president. He was preparing to campaign for re-election. The future stretched before him, bright and full of possibility. Then at 12:30 p.m. in Dealey Plaza, shots rang out. 1, 2, 3. The president's head snapped backward. Blood and brain matter sprayed across the white leather seats of the limousine. Jackie Kennedy, beautiful and composed just moments before, cradled her dying husband's head. The nation watched in horror as the film of Zapruder captured the exact moment when American innocence died on the pavement of a Texas street. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was dead at 46. The world reeled. America went into shock. The 1960s, which had begun with such hope and possibility, suddenly felt darker, more dangerous, more fragile. And the Kennedy family, which had seemed so golden, so untouchable, suddenly looked cursed. But the tragedy was far from over. Robert Francis Kennedy, Jack's youngest brother and his closest advisor, was devastated by the assassination. Bobby Kennedy had served as his brother's attorney general, and together they had navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Civil Rights Movement, and the turbulent waters of Cold War politics. After Jack's death, Bobby was consumed by grief and anger. But he did not remain consumed by grief for long. Bobby Kennedy possessed a different kind of magnetism than his brother Jack. Where Jack was cool and controlled, Bobby was passionate and idealistic. He believed deeply in justice, in fighting for the marginalized and the powerless. After Kennedy's assassination, Bobby ran for Senate in New York, and then in 1968, he launched a campaign for the presidency itself. He wanted to finish what his brother had started. He wanted to heal the nation that his brother's death had wounded. It was a noble ambition. It was also one that would cost him his life. On June 5, 1968, just after winning the California primary, Robert Kennedy was walking through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles when a young Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan stepped out of the crowd and fired multiple shots at close range. Kennedy was struck, mortally wounded. He hung on to life for a few days in intense pain and increasing delirium, but on June 6, 1968, Robert Francis Kennedy died. Another Kennedy. Another death. Another wound opened in the American psyche. 3 members of the family in positions of national power, Joe Jr., Jack, and Bobby, had all died violently. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Among historians and theologians and common people alike, whispers began. Not whispers of accident or coincidence, but whispers of curse. But if 3 deaths seemed like tragedy, 4 seemed like a pattern. And then came the 5th. Years had passed since the deaths of President Kennedy and Senator Kennedy. The 1970s and 1980s had moved on. The Kennedy children, Jack's children, Caroline and John Jr., had grown up in the shadow of their father's assassination. They had been small when their father died. Caroline was 6 years old. John Jr. was not even 3 years old. Their mother, the dignified and beautiful Jackie Kennedy, had raised them with remarkable strength and grace. Jackie had later remarried to Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping magnate, in a union that shocked the world and scandalized the more traditional elements of American society. But Jackie was determined to live her life on her own terms. She had already endured enough tragedy, enough scrutiny. She deserved happiness or at least peace. But the Kennedy name, even for those who merely carried it through marriage or birth, seemed to come with a burden. Caroline Kennedy grew up to be a remarkable woman, intelligent, compassionate, and deeply aware of her place in history. She became an author, an editor, and a diplomat. She lived a relatively quiet life, one marked by achievement but not by the kinds of tragedies that had plagued other members of her family. It seemed, for a moment, that perhaps the curse had finally loosened its grip. But John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. would not be so fortunate. John Jr. was born on November 25, 1960, just 11 days after his father's election to the presidency. He grew up in the White House, the most famous child in America. When his father was assassinated in November 1963, John Jr. was not yet 3 years old. He did not attend his father's funeral. He was too young to understand what death meant. But his childhood was forever marked by the image of that terrible day in Dallas, by the knowledge that his father had been taken from him by an act of violence. As John Jr. grew up, he became acutely aware of his place in history. He was the son of a slain president, the carrier of a name that meant something in America. He felt the weight of that legacy. He also felt the pull of it, the desire to do something meaningful, something that would honor his father's memory and prove that the Kennedy name still meant something. John Jr. was educated at Brown University and at New York University Law School. He was handsome, strikingly so, with his father's features and his mother's grace. He inherited his parents' intelligence and their charm. He became a lawyer working for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Later he founded a magazine called George, which explored the intersection of politics and popular culture in a way that was fresh and engaging. But John Jr. also had passions beyond the law and publishing. He was an accomplished pilot. He had obtained his pilot's license and spent considerable time flying small aircraft. Flying, to John Jr., represented freedom, a escape from the constant scrutiny and expectations that came with his name. On July 16, 1999, John Jr. decided to pilot a small plane, a Piper Saratoga, from New Jersey to Martha's Vineyard. He was planning to attend a family wedding. Flying alongside him were his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and his sister-in-law, Lauren Bessette. It was a clear night. The weather conditions were favorable. There was no indication that anything was wrong. But somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean in the darkness off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, something went terribly wrong. The plane disappeared from radar. Search and rescue teams were mobilized immediately. 4 days, there was hope that perhaps the plane had made it to a beach somewhere, that John Jr. and his companions were alive, waiting to be found. But days turned to weeks and eventually the wreckage was found. The plane had gone down in the ocean, killing all 3 passengers on board. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. was dead at 38 years old. The last male heir of the Kennedy dynasty, the man who might have carried the family name into the future, was gone. America mourned. The nation that had watched John Jr. grow up from the tragic child in the White House to a promising young man now watched as his light was extinguished. Jackie Kennedy, his mother, had died just 16 months earlier, mercifully spared the pain of losing her only son. For generations. 5 tragic deaths. The curse seemed complete. But the Kennedy family's suffering was not yet finished. In 1994, David Kennedy, the son of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, died of a drug overdose. David had struggled with addiction for much of his life, a struggle that seemed almost inevitable for a member of the Kennedy family, as if the weight of the name itself, the pressure to live up to the legacy, the knowledge of all the tragedy that had come before, drove some of them toward the escape that drugs offered. Then in 2020, Saoirse Kennedy Hill, the granddaughter of Robert F. Kennedy, died of a heroin overdose at the Kennedy family compound in Hyannisport. Saoirse was just 22 years old. She had been a student at Boston College, described by those who knew her as intelligent, beautiful, and troubled. She had struggled with depression and addiction. On the day she died, she overdosed in the family's home, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege that seemed, paradoxically, to have been unable to protect her. The official cause was ruled an accidental overdose. But for many who followed the Kennedy family's history, Saoirse's death seemed like part of a larger pattern, a continuation of the curse that had claimed so many members of this remarkable and tragic family. 5 tragic deaths. Joe Jr. in the skies over England. Jack in the streets of Dallas. Bobby in the kitchen of a Los Angeles hotel. John Jr. in the darkness over the Atlantic. And so many others, deaths from addiction, deaths from illness, deaths that seemed to confirm what many had come to believe, that there was something fundamentally tragic about being a Kennedy. But what exactly is the Kennedy curse? Is it real, or is it simply a narrative that we have constructed to explain a series of unfortunate events? Is it divine punishment, as some Catholics have suggested? Is it the inevitable collision of privilege and power with human fragility? Or is it something else entirely, something rooted in the ambitions and character of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the man who founded the dynasty? To understand the Kennedy curse, one must understand Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. He was a man of ambition so naked, so uncompromising, that it almost seemed to demand a price. He wanted power, yes, but more than that, he wanted his name to live forever. He wanted his sons to be presidents, his daughters to marry well, his legacy to reshape the course of American history. Joe Kennedy was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. He made his initial fortune through stock manipulation and insider trading, practices that were not technically illegal at the time but were morally dubious. He later made money in bootlegging during Prohibition, selling illegal alcohol to a thirsty nation. He was ruthless in business, cunning in his dealings, and utterly focused on the accumulation of power and wealth. But Joe Kennedy was also a father, and he was deeply invested in the success of his children. He coached his sons, pushed them relentlessly, demanded excellence in all things. He expected them to become great. He expected them to change the world. And in many ways he succeeded. His sons did become great. They did change the world. But ambition, when pursued at such a fever pitch, when demanded of children with such relentless intensity, carries consequences. The children of Joseph P. Kennedy lived under the weight of their father's expectations. They understood, at a fundamental level, that they were supposed to matter, that they were supposed to achieve great things. This understanding drove some of them toward achievement. But it also drove some of them toward darker places. Joe Kennedy's daughters were marginalized in this scheme of ambition. While his sons were groomed to become presidents and senators, his daughters were expected to marry well and produce heirs. One of his daughters, Rosemary Kennedy, was subjected to a transorbital lobotomy, a horrifying and controversial procedure that was supposed to cure her of mental illness but instead left her profoundly disabled. This act, performed without her consent, is now recognized as one of the darkest chapters in the Kennedy family history. The pressure, the expectations, the sense that one's entire worth and value were tied to external achievements and the continuation of the family legacy, these things took a psychological toll. Many Kennedy family members struggled with addiction, depression, and other mental health issues. The very structure of the Kennedy family seemed to create the conditions for tragedy. But tragedy is not inevitable. Tragedy is a choice, or at least the collision of circumstance and vulnerability, and perhaps, yes, a kind of curse. Let us examine more closely each of the 5 deaths that define the Kennedy curse. Joe Kennedy Jr. was, by all accounts, the most driven of all the Kennedy sons. He was the eldest and therefore bore the full weight of his father's ambitions. Joe Jr. was handsome, intelligent, and possessed of a kind of magnetic charisma that drew people to him. He was also deeply competitive. He wanted to win at everything. Whether it was athletics, academics, or the subtle competitions for his father's attention and approval, Joe Jr. was determined to be the best. During World War II, Joe Jr. was commissioned as a naval aviator. He flew patrol missions over the Atlantic and later volunteered for a particularly dangerous assignment. Operation Anvil, also known as Project Aphrodite, involved taking a B-24 Liberator bomber that had been packed with explosives and remote-control detonators, flying it to a point near the German-controlled French coast, and then bailing out so that the plane could be remotely detonated over a German target. The operation was extremely dangerous. Multiple pilots had already died attempting it. But Joe Jr., driven by his desire to perform an extraordinary feat, to be the hero that would save the war, volunteered anyway. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. took off from an air base in England. He was supposed to fly over the target area, arm the explosives, and then bail out. But somewhere over the channel, the explosives detonated prematurely. The explosion was so violent that Joe Jr.'s body was never recovered. He simply disappeared into the chaos of war, leaving behind a family traumatized by his death and a series of unanswered questions. What exactly had happened? Had there been a mechanical failure? Had an enemy shell struck the plane? Had there been some other explanation? The truth was lost, and in its place, a legend grew. Joe Kennedy Jr. had died heroically, attempting a dangerous mission to defeat Nazi Germany. He had died as a soldier should die, in service to his country, making the ultimate sacrifice. But the reality was perhaps more complicated. Joe Jr., driven by his own ambition and his need to prove himself, had volunteered for a mission that was more likely to kill him than to succeed. He had, in some sense, chosen this fate. Or at least, he had chosen to put himself in a position where fate could claim him. Years later, John F. Kennedy would speak about his brother's death, about the loss of Joe Jr., about the way that loss had shaped the direction of his own life. And perhaps it is in this that we see the first thread of the curse, the idea that ambition, when pursued at such a fever pitch, when elevated to the level of a family religion, carries consequences that echo through generations. President John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas on November 22, 1963, remains one of the most controversial deaths in American history. The official conclusion reached by the Warren Commission was that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, fired 3 shots from the Texas School Book Depository, striking the president twice and striking Governor John Connally once. But this conclusion has been disputed by historians, conspiracy theorists, and researchers for more than 6 decades. Acoustic evidence suggests that there may have been a second shooter. The trajectory of the bullet seems, to many experts, to defy the physics of the official explanation. And the timing, the fact that the president was shot just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, just weeks after the signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, just as the Vietnam War was beginning to escalate, has led many to speculate about possible motives and possible conspirators. Was Kennedy killed by Oswald alone, as the Warren Commission concluded? Or was he killed as part of a conspiracy involving the CIA, the Mafia, the Cubans, or some combination of powerful forces that saw him as a threat? The truth is that we may never know. The evidence has been lost, destroyed, or classified. The witnesses have died or changed their stories. And President Kennedy remains in death, a mystery. But what we do know is this: John F. Kennedy was killed in a public, brutal manner, in front of his wife, in front of the world. His assassination shocked the nation and cast a shadow over American politics that has never fully lifted. It proved beyond any doubt that power does not protect you, that wealth does not save you, that being the President of the United States does not mean that you are safe. And it set in motion a series of events that would claim more Kennedy lives. Robert F. Kennedy, devastated by his brother's death but determined to continue his work, threw himself into his career as a senator and as an advocate for social justice. Bobby was in many ways more idealistic than his brother Jack. While Jack had been pragmatic and realpolitik-minded, Bobby believed deeply in the power of government to help the poor and the marginalized. Bobby Kennedy championed civil rights causes. He spoke out against the Vietnam War. He advocated for the poor and the powerless. He became a hero to many Americans who felt that the government should be doing more to address inequality and injustice. In 1968, after Jack's assassination and after years of political activism, Bobby Kennedy decided to run for president. He had been pushed toward this decision by many of those around him, by the sense that he could win, that he could take back the White House for the Kennedy family, that he could complete the work that his brother Jack had started. For a brief moment it seemed like Bobby Kennedy might actually win. He defeated Eugene McCarthy in the California primary. He was building momentum. The Kennedy name still carried power in American politics. It seemed for a moment that perhaps the family's run of bad luck might finally be ending. But on June 5, 1968, as Bobby Kennedy walked through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he was shot multiple times by Sirhan Sirhan, a young Palestinian man who harbored a grudge against Kennedy for his support of Israel during the Six-Day War. Bobby Kennedy died a day later, on June 6, 1968. The nation reeled. Two Kennedy brothers, both killed by bullets. Both killed while in positions of national prominence. Both killed before their time. The grief of the Kennedy family was compounded by the realization that they had lost another leader, another voice, another son. And as 1968 gave way to 1969, and as the nation processed these tragedies, it became increasingly clear that the Kennedy family was marked by tragedy in a way that few other families were. The deaths were not flukes. They were not coincidences. They were a pattern. But the curse would not be satisfied with 3 deaths. It would demand more. The 1970s and 1980s saw the Kennedy family grappling with the aftermath of the deaths of Jack and Bobby. The surviving Kennedys tried to move forward with their lives, tried to build careers and families of their own. Some succeeded. Others struggled. Many members of the Kennedy family battled addiction: cocaine, alcohol, heroin. It was as if the weight of the family legacy, the pressure to live up to the achievements of Jack and Bobby, the knowledge that they were constantly being compared to their more famous relatives, drove some of them toward the escape that drugs offered. David Kennedy, the son of Robert F. Kennedy, had struggled with drugs for much of his life. He had been arrested multiple times on drug charges. He had been through rehabilitation programs. But the pull of addiction was too strong. In 1984, at the age of 28, David Kennedy was found dead in a hotel room in Palm Beach, Florida, the victim of a drug overdose. The official cause of death was ruled accidental, caused by a combination of cocaine and prescription medications. David's death seemed to confirm what many had begun to believe, that the Kennedy curse was not just about deaths from bullets and bombs and airplane crashes. It was also about deaths from addiction, from despair, from the psychological toll of carrying the Kennedy name into an era when the dynasty's moment of greatness had passed. But the deaths would continue. In 1997, Michael Kennedy, another son of Robert F. Kennedy, died in a skiing accident near Aspen, Colorado. Michael had been skiing down a slope when he attempted to hit a tree with a football, a reckless and dangerous stunt. He collided with a tree and suffered a fatal head injury. And then, in 2020, Saoirse Kennedy Hill, just 22 years old, died of a heroin overdose at the Kennedy family compound in Hyannisport. Saoirse had been beautiful and talented, a student at Boston College with her whole life ahead of her. But she had struggled with depression and addiction. She had sought treatment. She had tried to get clean. But in the end, the darkness was too strong. Saoirse's death seemed to bring the curse full circle, from Joe Jr. dying in service to his country, to Jack and Bobby dying in pursuit of political power, to the next generation dying from the effects of the pressure and the legacy and the impossible weight of the Kennedy name. So what is the Kennedy curse? How do we explain the extraordinary concentration of tragedy in this one family? Is it supernatural? Is it psychological? Is it structural? Some have pointed to the influence of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. They argue that the ruthlessness with which he pursued his ambitions, the way he pushed his sons toward achievement without regard for their own desires or well-being, set in motion a series of consequences that echoed through generations. The sons of Joe Kennedy felt the weight of his expectations. They felt driven to achieve great things, to live up to the family legacy, to prove that they were worthy of the Kennedy name. This pressure, this relentless drive toward achievement and prominence, may have made them more likely to take risks. Joe Jr. volunteered for a dangerous bombing mission. Jack and Bobby entered into high-stakes political careers where they were exposed to violence and assassination. John Jr. pursued his passion for flying despite the inherent dangers of piloting a small aircraft. Others have pointed to luck, or the lack thereof. They argue that the Kennedy family has simply been extraordinarily unlucky. The deaths of Joe Jr., Jack, Bobby, and John Jr. were not predictable events. They were not inevitable consequences of the family's structure or character. They were accidents and acts of violence that could have happened to any family, and it just so happened that they happened to the Kennedys. Still others have pointed to a kind of cultural curse, the idea that the media attention and public scrutiny of the Kennedy family, combined with the family's own desire to live their lives in a way that was remarkable and exceptional, created conditions that made tragedy more likely. If you are constantly being watched, constantly being analyzed, constantly being held up as an example of American greatness or American failure, does that increase the likelihood of tragedy? Does the pressure of being famous in America create conditions that are inherently dangerous? And then there are those who believe in the curse in a more literal sense, that there is something supernatural at work, that the Kennedy family has been marked by fate or by divine punishment, that there is a darkness that attaches itself to certain families and refuses to let go. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of all of these explanations. The Kennedy curse is real in the sense that the deaths were real, the suffering was real, the loss was real. But whether the curse is supernatural or psychological or structural or simply the result of bad luck, the effect is the same. The Kennedy family has been touched by tragedy in a way that few families have, and that fact has shaped their history and their legacy in profound ways. Let us now turn our attention to the individuals themselves, to the specific stories of loss and tragedy that make up the fabric of the Kennedy curse. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. was born in 1915, the eldest son of Joseph and Rose Kennedy. From the moment of his birth, Joe Jr. was destined for greatness. His father had already begun mapping out his son's future. Harvard, then law school, then politics. Joe Jr. would be the first Kennedy president. He would restore the family name to prominence. He would change the world. But before Joe Jr. could fulfill his destiny, he had to first survive his childhood. And childhood in the Kennedy household was not like childhood in most American homes. It was competitive, intense, and driven by a sense of purpose that transcended the normal concerns of childhood: play, imagination, the simple joy of being young. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was a demanding father. He expected his children to excel in all things. He took them sailing and pushed them to overcome their fears of the water. He took them to sporting events and expected them to be the best on the field or on the court. He talked to them about politics and history and current events, preparing them for the roles he envisioned them playing in the future. Joe Jr. responded to this pressure by excelling in almost everything he attempted. He was a good student, a competent athlete, a charming and engaging young man. He attended Harvard, where he continued his pattern of achievement. He was popular, well-liked, and seemed destined for the great things his father had envisioned for him. After graduating from Harvard, Joe Jr. attended Harvard Law School, following the path that his father had outlined for him. He was preparing to enter politics, to begin his ascent toward the presidency, when World War II intervened. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. America was at war. And suddenly Joe Jr. saw an opportunity to prove himself not just as a Kennedy, but as an American hero. Joe Jr. joined the Navy and trained as a pilot. He served with distinction in the Naval Air Forces, flying patrol missions over the Atlantic and then over Europe as the war progressed. He was brave, competent, and driven by the same need to excel that had defined him since childhood. But Joe Jr. was also ambitious in a way that bordered on recklessness. When Operation Anvil was proposed, the dangerous bombing mission in which a remote-controlled B-24 would be flown over German targets by pilots who would bail out before detonation, Joe Jr. volunteered immediately. His commanding officers were surprised by his eagerness. This was an extremely dangerous mission. Many pilots had already died attempting it. But Joe Jr. saw it as an opportunity to perform an extraordinary feat of valor, to be the hero that would be talked about for generations. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. boarded his plane and took off from an air base in England. The mission was supposed to be routine: fly over the target, arm the explosives, bail out, and return safely to base. But somewhere over the channel something went terribly wrong. The B-24 exploded in mid-air. The explosion was so violent that witnesses saw it light up the sky. The plane simply disintegrated, and Joe Jr. was lost in the chaos of war. Joe Kennedy Sr. received the news of his son's death in a way that befitted the times. A military messenger came to his office and delivered the information in a formal, bureaucratic manner. Joe Jr. was dead. There were no remains to return. There was no body to bury. There was just the knowledge that his eldest son, the heir apparent, the future of the Kennedy dynasty, was gone. The impact on the family was devastating. Rose Kennedy, a woman of deep faith, found solace in her religion. Joe Kennedy Sr., a man of immense pride, withdrew into himself. And Jack Kennedy, Joe Jr.'s younger brother, suddenly found the weight of the family's expectations falling upon his shoulders. In his will, Joe Kennedy Sr. had specified that Jack would become the focus of the family's political ambitions if anything happened to Joe Jr. Now that Joe Jr. was dead, that contingency plan had been activated. Jack would be groomed to become president. Jack would carry the family name into the future. The burden that had previously been Joe Jr.'s was now Jack's to bear. This is an important point to understand about the Kennedy curse. It is not just about individual tragedies. It is about how those tragedies cascaded through the family, how the death of one member created conditions that increased the likelihood of tragedy for other members. Joe Jr.'s death set Jack on a path toward politics and power that would ultimately lead to his assassination. If Joe Jr. had lived, Jack might have become a lawyer or a writer or pursued some other path. The presidency might never have been Jack's to fulfill. But because Joe Jr. died, Jack had to step into his brother's shoes. And in stepping into those shoes, Jack walked toward his own fate. This pattern of how one tragedy creates the conditions for another tragedy is woven throughout the Kennedy family history. It is one of the reasons why the Kennedy curse feels like something more than just random bad luck. It feels like a cascade, a series of dominoes falling, each death creating the circumstances that lead to the next. Jack Kennedy, as we have discussed, eventually did become president. He survived World War II, where he commanded PT-109 and showed bravery and resourcefulness when his boat was attacked. He entered politics in 1946 and rose steadily through the ranks, congressman, senator, and then in 1960 president. But the path from Joe Jr.'s death to Jack's presidency was not a straight line. Along the way, Jack struggled with health problems. He had Addison's disease, an autoimmune disorder that caused chronic fatigue and required ongoing hormone replacement therapy. He had back pain from an old PT-109 injury. He suffered from various infections and illnesses. Many of these health problems were kept secret from the American public. Jack's father and his advisors understood that if the American people knew the extent of Jack's health issues, they would not vote for him. So the illnesses were covered up, managed quietly, kept out of the public eye. Jack also had numerous affairs throughout his marriage to Jacqueline Bouvier. He was a serial philanderer, a man who seemed unable or unwilling to be faithful to his wife. His affairs included relationships with actresses, secretaries, the wives of his friends, and women of questionable background and reputation. One of Jack's most dangerous liaisons was with Judith Campbell Exner, a woman who was also simultaneously involved with Sam Giancana, a major figure in organized crime. This connection created a potential security vulnerability, as Jack's sexual liaison with a woman who also had connections to the mafia could have been used for blackmail or coercion. In spite of, or perhaps because of, these various complications, Jack Kennedy became president in 1960, the youngest president ever elected to the office. He brought with him a sense of youth, energy, and optimism. The American public loved him. They saw in him the possibility of a new America, one that was energetic and progressive and not bound by the constraints of the past. Jack Kennedy's presidency was marked by several major events and crises. In his first year, he authorized the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt by CIA-backed Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro. The invasion was a disaster, and it damaged Kennedy's credibility on the international stage. In 1961, Kennedy met with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna, a summit that was supposed to establish a personal relationship between the two leaders but instead resulted in Khrushchev's conclusion that Kennedy was weak and inexperienced. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. American spy planes had discovered that the Soviet Union was placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Kennedy was faced with a choice. He could order a military invasion of Cuba to remove the missiles, or he could impose a naval blockade and demand that the Soviets remove the missiles. Kennedy chose the blockade. For 13 days, the world held its breath as the US and the Soviet Union stood at the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy remained calm, projecting confidence even as he privately acknowledged that the stakes had never been higher. In the end, Khrushchev blinked first, and the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis enhanced his reputation as a strong leader capable of navigating international crises with wisdom and restraint. But there were darker aspects of Kennedy's presidency as well. As the war in Vietnam escalated, Kennedy authorized the overthrow of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, an action that resulted in Diem's death. Kennedy also authorized various CIA operations against Cuba and other countries. He escalated American involvement in Vietnam, committing additional military advisors and increasing the scope of American military operations. These actions, which were kept secret from the American public at the time, would have serious consequences. They also created enemies: people in Cuba, people in Vietnam, people in various intelligence agencies and in organized crime who felt that Kennedy was a threat to their interests. By late 1963, Kennedy was preparing to campaign for re-election. He was planning a trip to Texas to shore up political support and to prepare for the campaign ahead. He was riding high, popular at home, respected internationally with a growing approval rating. And then, on November 22, 1963, as he rode through Dealey Plaza in Dallas in an open-top limousine, his skull was shattered by a sniper's bullet. The world watched as the President of the United States was killed in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, in front of television cameras. The American dream that Jack Kennedy had embodied seemed to die with him on that Dallas street. For the Kennedy family, the death of Jack was catastrophic. Not only had they lost a beloved son and brother, but they had also lost the centerpiece of their political ambitions. Jack had been supposed to reign for 2 terms, to establish the Kennedy family as the dominant force in American politics for a generation. Instead, he was dead and his presidency had been cut short. But the tragedy did not end with Jack's death. Indeed, in many ways it was only beginning. Robert Francis Kennedy, Jack's younger brother and his closest confidant, had served as Attorney General during Jack's presidency. Bobby was a different kind of Kennedy than Jack. While Jack had been pragmatic and calculating, Bobby was idealistic and driven by a sense of moral purpose. As Attorney General, Bobby had pursued organized crime figures with relentless intensity. He had taken on the mafia, the gangsters and racketeers who had long operated with impunity in American cities. He had also championed civil rights, using the power of the Justice Department to fight racial discrimination and to enforce voting rights. Bobby Kennedy also had a significant role in managing the Cuba crisis and in various secret operations against Castro. He was aware of and participated in various CIA plots to assassinate Castro. He also knew about or at least suspected his brother's various affairs and indiscretions. After Jack's assassination, Bobby was devastated. The 2 brothers had been extraordinarily close, and Bobby's grief was profound. But rather than withdraw from public life as many might have done, Bobby channeled his grief into action. In 1964, after leaving the Attorney General's office, Bobby ran for Senate in New York. He won the election and took his seat in the Senate in 1965. As a senator, Bobby became an increasingly vocal critic of the Vietnam War. He spoke out against America's military involvement in Southeast Asia. He championed civil rights causes. He advocated for the poor and the marginalized. Bobby Kennedy became a hero to many Americans, particularly to younger Americans who were questioning American foreign policy and demanding social change. His popularity grew, and it became increasingly apparent that he was considering a run for the presidency. In early 1968, after President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election, Bobby Kennedy entered the race for the Democratic presidential nomination. He faced off against Vice President Hubert Humphrey and against Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, who had become an anti-war candidate. Bobby Kennedy campaigned hard. He traveled throughout the country giving speeches, shaking hands, connecting with voters. He seemed to have the magic that his brother Jack had possessed. He seemed to embody the possibility of a new America, one that was more just, more compassionate, more willing to confront the issues of poverty and racism and war that were tearing the nation apart. On June 4, 1968, Bobby Kennedy won the California primary. He had won decisively, with strong support from Hispanic voters and from younger voters who were inspired by his vision for America. The momentum seemed to be in his favor. It looked as though he might actually secure the Democratic nomination and have a real chance at becoming president. That night, Bobby Kennedy went to the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles to celebrate his victory with supporters and campaign staff. He gave a speech to the crowd. He was in good spirits, optimistic about his chances going forward. But as Kennedy walked through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, leaving the ballroom where he had been celebrating, a young man named Sirhan stepped out of the crowd and opened fire with a handgun. Sirhan shot Kennedy multiple times, striking him in the head and the body. Kennedy was rushed to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe. He lingered for a day, struggling for breath, slipping in and out of consciousness. On June 6, 1968, just hours into the day Robert Francis Kennedy died. The nation was shocked. For the second time in 5 years, a Kennedy had been killed by an assassin's bullet. The possibility of a Kennedy presidency had been extinguished again. The hope that many Americans had invested in Bobby Kennedy, hope for a different kind of America, one that was more just and more compassionate, died with him. The impact on the Kennedy family was immense. They had now lost 3 members in positions of national prominence: Joe Jr. in the war, Jack to an assassin's bullet, and now Bobby, also to an assassin's bullet. The deaths seemed to confirm what many had begun to suspect, that there was indeed a curse attached to the Kennedy name, that power and prominence and the pursuit of the presidency carried with them a terrible price. 4 years after Bobby Kennedy's death, the Kennedy family retreated from national politics. There were no more presidential campaigns. There were no more attempts to seize power at the highest levels of government. The family seemed to accept that their time at the center of American power had passed. But the curse had not finished with the Kennedy family. It still had more victims to claim. In the 1970s and 1980s, various members of the Kennedy family struggled with addiction issues. The use of cocaine, heroin, and alcohol became a problem for many of them. Some observers attributed this to the weight of the family legacy, to the pressure of living up to the achievements of Jack and Bobby, to the knowledge that they were being constantly compared to their more famous relatives. David Kennedy, the son of Robert F. Kennedy, had been struggling with drug addiction since his teenage years. He had been arrested on multiple occasions. He had been through various rehabilitation programs. But the addiction had a grip on him that seemed impossible to break. On April 25, 1984, David Kennedy was found dead in his room at the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 28 years old. The cause of death was ruled an accidental overdose, caused by a combination of cocaine and prescription medications. David's death seemed to bring the curse into a new phase. Where previously the deaths had been dramatic, deaths from airplane crashes, deaths from assassins' bullets, now the deaths were coming from addiction, from despair, from the slow and grinding weight of depression and substance abuse. But the deaths would continue and they would claim younger and younger victims. In 1997, Michael Kennedy, another son of Robert F. Kennedy, died in a skiing accident near Aspen, Colorado. Michael was 40 years old. He had been an environmental lawyer and a businessman. He had been married and had children. On December 31, 1997, Michael Kennedy was skiing on a slope near Aspen when he engaged in what would later be described as a dangerous and reckless stunt. He attempted to hit a football while skiing down the slope. In attempting to do so, he collided with a tree at high speed. He suffered a severe head injury and died from his injuries. Michael Kennedy's death once again raised questions about the Kennedy curse. Here was a man in the prime of his life, engaging in a reckless and dangerous activity that ended in his death. Was it simply an accident, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone? Or was it something darker? Was Michael, like so many other members of the Kennedy family, unconsciously seeking out danger, unconsciously walking toward his own demise? And then came 1999, and the death that would, in many ways, close the circle of the Kennedy curse, the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. John Jr. was born on November 25, 1960, just 11 days after his father's election to the presidency. He grew up in the White House during his father's presidency. He was the most famous child in America, the subject of constant media attention and public fascination. When his father was assassinated, John Jr. was just days short of his 3rd birthday. He did not remember his father. His knowledge of his father came entirely from historical records, photographs, and stories told by family members and by the American public. As John Jr. grew up, he became increasingly aware of his place in history. He was the son of a slain president, the carrier of one of the most famous names in America. He felt the weight of that legacy. He also felt the pull of it. John Jr. was educated at private schools and at Brown University. He attended New York University Law School and became a lawyer, working for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. But John Jr. was not entirely content with the role of lawyer. He had creative ambitions. He wanted to be more than just another lawyer from an important family. In 1995, he founded a magazine called George, which explored the intersection of politics and popular culture. The magazine was meant to make politics accessible and interesting to younger Americans, to engage them with current events in a way that was fresh and engaging. George was generally well received, though it struggled with profitability. But more importantly, George gave John Jr. an outlet for his creative ambitions. He was no longer just the son of a slain president. He was a publisher, an editor, a man with his own independent accomplishments and identity. But John Jr. had other passions as well. One of those passions was flying. John Jr. had obtained his pilot's license and spent considerable time flying small aircraft. Flying, to John Jr., was a form of freedom and escape from the constant scrutiny and expectations that came with his famous name. John Jr. was also married to Carolyn Bessette, a woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence who worked in the fashion industry. Carolyn was not from a famous family, and in many ways she provided John Jr. with a connection to normalcy, to a world outside of the Kennedy dynasty and its attendant pressures. In July 1999, John Jr. and Carolyn decided to attend a family wedding in Martha's Vineyard. John Jr. decided to fly himself and Carolyn, along with Carolyn's sister Lauren Bessette, to Martha's Vineyard in a small Piper Saratoga aircraft. The decision to fly himself was not unusual. John Jr. was an experienced pilot with many hours of flight time. The weather conditions on the evening of July 16, 1999, were reasonably good. There was no indication that anything would go wrong. But something did go wrong. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, in the darkness off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, the Piper Saratoga disappeared from radar. Authorities immediately launched a search and rescue operation. 4 days, there was hope that perhaps the plane had made it to a beach somewhere, that the 3 passengers were alive and waiting to be rescued. But those hopes were dashed when wreckage from the plane was discovered on the ocean floor. The plane had gone down in the water. All 3 passengers had been killed. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. was dead at 38 years old. The last male heir of the Kennedy dynasty, the man who might have carried the family name into the future, was gone. America mourned. News networks broadcast tributes to John Jr. Thousands of people lined the streets in New York to pay their respects. The nation that had watched John Jr. grow up from the tragic child in the White House, son of a slain president, to a promising young man now watched as his light was extinguished. The official cause of the crash was determined to be pilot error. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, investigation, John Jr. had become disoriented in the darkness and overcast conditions and had flown the plane into the ocean while attempting to fly level. But this explanation did not satisfy many observers. John Jr. was an experienced pilot. He had extensive training in instrument flying. Why would he have become so disoriented? Some suggested that perhaps he had made an error in judgment, that perhaps he had attempted the flight despite weather conditions that were marginal. Others suggested that perhaps there had been a mechanical failure. And still others wondered whether there was something about the Kennedy name itself, something about the family's history of tragedy, that had finally claimed its ultimate victim. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. The Kennedy family had lost another member to untimely death. The curse, it seemed, was not yet done with them. But the death of John Jr. was not the last tragedy to strike the Kennedy family. In 2020, 37 years after David Kennedy's overdose death and 21 years after John Jr.'s plane crash, Saoirse Kennedy Hill, the granddaughter of Robert F. Kennedy, died of a heroin overdose. Saoirse was born in 1997. She was the daughter of Courtney Kennedy Hill and Paul Michael Hill. She was raised in the Kennedy family, surrounded by wealth and privilege and the weight of the family legacy. Saoirse was described by those who knew her as intelligent, beautiful, and talented. She was a student at Boston College. She seemed to have potential. She seemed to have a future. But Saoirse also struggled with depression and addiction. She had sought treatment. She had tried to get clean. But the pull of the drug was too strong. On August 1, 2020, Saoirse Kennedy Hill was found dead in a room at the Kennedy family compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. She had overdosed on heroin. She was just 22 years old. The cause of death was ruled accidental. But for many who had been following the Kennedy family's history, Saoirse's death seemed like a continuation of a pattern that had been established decades earlier. A pattern of tragedy, addiction, despair, and untimely death. The Kennedy curse had claimed another victim. Another life had been cut short. Another family member had succumbed to the weight of the legacy and the pressure and the darkness that seemed to surround the Kennedy name. But what does it all mean? What can we take away from this history of tragedy and loss? What does the Kennedy curse tell us about power and privilege and the human condition? One thing that seems clear is that the Kennedy family story is not unique in its tragedy. Throughout human history, powerful families have been struck by repeated tragedy. The House of Aetruus in ancient Greece suffered through generation after generation of murder and revenge and curse. European royal families have experienced epidemic levels of mental illness, addiction, and untimely death. The question is not whether tragedy strikes powerful families but why. Some argue that power itself carries within it the seeds of tragedy. When you have too much money, when you have too much attention, when you have too many expectations placed upon you, the result can be a kind of psychological fragmentation. Some people thrive under such conditions, channeling the pressure into achievement and accomplishment. Others break under the weight of it. And some seem to walk deliberately toward destruction, as if the tragedy is inevitable and they are simply accepting their fate. Others argue that the Kennedy curse is psychological rather than supernatural. The Kennedy children grew up knowing their family's history of tragedy. They knew that their father had been assassinated. They knew that their uncle had been assassinated. They knew that other family members had died in accidents and from overdoses. This knowledge created a psychological framework in which tragedy seemed inevitable, in which danger seemed to surround them. If you believe that death is coming for you, if you believe that your family is cursed, then perhaps you are more likely to take risks that increase the likelihood of that death. Perhaps you are less likely to take precautions. Perhaps you unconsciously walk toward the fate that you believe is inevitable. This psychological explanation has merit. There is substantial research suggesting that belief shapes reality, that our expectations influence our behavior and our outcomes. If the Kennedy children grew up expecting tragedy, they may have unconsciously created the conditions that led to tragedy. But there is also the question of luck, of random chance, of the collision of probability and circumstance. Sometimes tragic things simply happen. Sometimes people die in plane crashes. Sometimes people are killed by assassins. Sometimes people overdose on drugs. These things happen to people from all walks of life, from all socioeconomic backgrounds. The Kennedy family has experienced an unusually high concentration of tragedy, that is certain. But is the concentration so unusual that it demands a supernatural explanation? Or is it the kind of thing that, given the visibility of the Kennedy family and the amount of media attention they have received, simply seems more notable than it actually is? It is difficult to say. The Kennedy curse exists at the intersection of fact and interpretation, of what actually happened and what we believe happened, of historical record and historical narrative. What is certain is this: the Kennedy family has experienced profound tragedy. They have lost family members to violence, to accident, to addiction, and to despair. They have experienced loss on a scale that few families have experienced. And that tragedy has shaped not just the family's history, but the history of the nation as well. The deaths of Jack and Bobby Kennedy changed the trajectory of American politics and foreign policy. If Jack had not been assassinated, Vietnam might have ended differently. If Bobby had not been assassinated, American politics in the late 1960s and beyond might have taken a different path. The death of John Jr. removed from the world a young man who might have gone on to accomplish great things, who might have carried the Kennedy legacy into the future in a new and different way. And the deaths from addiction and despair, the deaths of David Kennedy, Michael Kennedy, and Saoirse Kennedy Hill, serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of wealth and privilege, about the ways in which external advantages do not protect us from internal demons, about the ways in which the weight of family legacy and expectation can crush even the brightest and most talented among us. The Kennedy curse is not just a historical curiosity or a piece of American folklore. It is a window into the human condition, into the ways that power and privilege and tragedy intersect, into the ways that individual lives are shaped by forces larger than themselves. The Kennedy family story is a story of greatness and tragedy intertwined. It is a story of ambition pursued at great cost. It is a story of family bonds that are stretched to the breaking point by the weight of expectation and legacy. And it is, finally, a story about the price of power, the price that individuals pay, the price that families pay, the price that nations pay when they chase greatness without regard for the human cost. For generations of Kennedys have walked through history. 5 of them have died tragic deaths. And the curse, if it exists, continues to hover over the family name, a dark shadow that refuses to lift, a reminder that even in America, even with money and power and privilege, tragedy can strike without warning, without mercy, and without any regard for our hopes or our dreams or our aspirations for the future. The Kennedy family story is America's story. It is a story about who we are, what we value, and what we are willing to sacrifice in our pursuit of greatness. And it is a story that continues to haunt us, to remind us that power comes at a cost, that legacy carries a burden, and that sometimes, the greatest tragedies are not the ones we see coming, but the ones that strike suddenly and without warning, changing everything in an instant.